Mute you. I'm going to mute you as well. Paul, we're uh, let's start the live streaming. I'm going to mute you as well.
Okay, it's live.
Paul, we're uh, let's start the live streaming. You, sorry, that was my computer. Okay. Um, Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for this very important event celebrating the revolutionary contributions of Michael Parenti, who died on the 24th of January, just about 4 weeks ago, at the age of 92. We felt it was very important to honor Parenti's legacy by bringing together some of the people that worked with him and some of the people that have been inspired by him. I'm not going to say too much myself because, well, we've got lots of speakers who I think will cover the most important aspects much better than I would. But I just want to say, by way of introduction, that Parenti's work is really an invaluable resource for the study of and struggle against imperialism, capitalism, and social chauvinism. He was a genuine working class intellectual who remained true to the principles and the positions of global class struggle, never watering down his analysis for the sake of respectability, for the sake of popularity, for the sake of tenure, or indeed a well paid job. He supported the socialist countries. He supported anti-imperialist struggle. He supported the oppressed and exploited everywhere. And in contrast to most academics, he was someone who wrote and spoke in order to communicate ideas, not to make himself look clever. He had this unparalleled and I would say quite enviable ability to condense important ideas into accessible, easily understood language. And reading back over some of his books in the last few weeks, I've been struck by the enduring relevance of his analysis. For example, Cuba is currently under major threat. Parenti always defended Cuban socialism, and his analysis of the whole history of what he called siege socialism, these attempts to build a new society in the context of imperialist encirclement, could hardly be more relevant. The US right now is waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. So how much it resonates to read Michael Parenti's 1999 book on the Yugoslavia war, in which he says, Western leaders talk of peace and they perpetrate merciless wars. They call for democracy while supporting ex-Nazis and fostering despotic intercessions. They hail self-determination while exercising coercive colonial rule over other peoples. They denounce ethnic cleansing while practicing it themselves. And meanwhile, the Trump regime is threatening to go to war against Iran. Parenti was a true anti-war intellectual and organizer, and his analysis of the role of the media in building public support for imperialist war is indispensable at a time when the Western ruling classes, both right-wing and supposedly liberal, or what the Iranians are currently referring to as the Epstein class, is spreading every type of slander about Iran. Michael Parenti knew that, as he wrote, the struggle against war and aggression begins at home, and countering the propaganda war is a crucial component of that struggle. For those of us who want to honor and further Parenti's legacy, countering the lies about China, countering the lies about Iran, about Cuba, about Venezuela, about Russia, and other targets of imperialism is a central task. So, with that out of the way, let's hear from our speakers. We've organized the speakers order such that people for whom it's currently late, that is people in Asia, are going to speak first. Then in the second half, our American friends can enjoy a Trump-style hemispheric hegemony. So first off, we've got Ben Norton. Ben is pretty well known to our audience, I think. He's the editor of Geopolitical Economy Report and an important voice in the defense of actually existing socialism and the global struggle against imperialism. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you for the very kind words in the introduction. I'm going to share a brief presentation I made. So I hope everyone can see that. Carlos, can everyone see it? Okay, great. So thank you for inviting me. This is an important event for me personally because Parenti was a huge influence on me. And especially, of course, I'll talk about the Parenti-Chomsky divide. That'll be the end of my presentation. And Michael Parenti was a very important figure for me to kind of transition away from when I was very young and I was susceptible to this kind of Chomskyan, ostensibly left-wing critique of imperialism that often falls into the trap of helping imperialism. I think Parenti was one of the best voices in opposing that trap. But let's start by in this brief presentation, I began by just making a list. I was thinking in the past few weeks after the passing of this legend, I was thinking of what made him so great and why he was, I think, such an important figure. And of course, I think the first and most important aspect is how principled he was, especially to anti-imperialism and defense of actually existing socialism. And the flip side of that is he was always steadfastly opposed to opportunism. This is a point that I'll come back later, which is related to his humility, because we see that many people on the Western left in particular are enticed by the ivory tower and the idea that, you know, if they sacrifice some of their principles, especially consistent anti-imperialism, they can get, you know, a nice, comfortable position in a university. And Parenti never had tenure. He refused to sacrifice his principles in order to get this kind of cushy position that we see, especially with a figure like Chomsky. Parenti was also always extremely accessible, and this is, I think, one of the most important things about his books and certainly his articles and speeches. He wrote with extreme clarity, and there's no obscurantism, which is, you know, especially if you read many of the intellectuals of his generation. You know, the peak of his work was in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And this is, you know, the peak of postmodernism in Western academia. Negri and Hart, these people, you know, who write about empire as some abstract concept. No, Parenti understood very clearly how you must be concrete and clear. And this relates to another point. He was always deeply engaged with the public as a true public intellectual. His audience was the actual people, average people, not fellow intellectuals. And compare it, especially look at like some of the philosophical work of someone like Slavoj Žižek and compare it to Parenti. The clarity of Parenti's writing, compare him to Lacan, someone like that. I mean, it's just night and day. It's clear that so many ostensibly left-wing intellectuals in the West are writing to other intellectuals to show how sophisticated and smart they are. And then this brings us to, I think, the kind of crux of why Parenti was never given tenure and why he was forced to be an independent intellectual and was not financially comfortable. And it's because he always defended actually existing socialism. And for him, the defense of actually existing socialism was more important than becoming a famous intellectual. And he was not obsessed with theoretical purity, which is the obsession of so many people on the Western left. And there was always a deep historical grounding in all of his books and articles. And I write, he put the history back in historical materialism in the sense that you must understand every existing socialist experiment in the very imperfect context of their larger material conditions, which should be uncontroversial given Marx himself famously said, the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare in the brains of the living. And yet so many people love to criticize Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela and China and every other actually existing socialist project for those very imperfect conditions that they're situated in. And then finally, I think something that's always so great about Parenti is the humor that pervades his work. I mean, I've been going back after he passed, rereading some of his books and especially rewatching his lectures. And you know, people would joke that his lectures were like 80% great information, 10% him fighting with the microphone and the sound guy, and 10% jokes. I mean, he was almost kind of a stand-up comedian at some points. He always had a great sense of humor, which was so important, I think, especially thinking about the time where, you know, when he was most active, which was, you know, a very dark time of counter-revolution with the counter-revolutionary movements in the global South, the rise of neoliberalism, the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the, you know, Sandinistas fell out of power in 1990, Cuba entered the special period. I mean, it was a time of extreme counter-revolution, and a lot of left-wing intellectuals, a lot of Marxist intellectuals turned to, you know, become liberals and social democrats, and it was a very difficult moment. And Parenti, you know, continued holding the torch throughout that very difficult moment. And this brings me back to the kind of most important point that I'll conclude with, which is the principled commitment to anti-imperialism that pervades Parenti's work. And I want to briefly look at the shameful New York Times obituary written this February after Parenti passed. It's titled, Michael Parenti, Unapologetic Marxist Theorist and Author, Dies at 92. And I think this is the perfect illustration from the imperial paper of record. Of course, the New York Times has supported every imperialist war of aggression, printing lies to justify crimes against humanity. So it's, of course, no surprise to see this, but I think it's a perfect illustration of all the points that I've been discussing, because in this article, they mention some of these people who, have been described as part of the compatible left. This is a term that was used by the CIA, actually, to refer to left-wing intellectuals and activists who took anti-communist positions, or at least anti-imperialist positions. People like Chomsky, who have always been very critical of consistent anti-imperialists and certainly critical of every actually existing socialist government. So I'm going to look at a few quotes from this New York Times article. It described Parenti dismissively as a Marxist political theorist with uncompromising views, which is their way of saying, a dinosaur who, after the Soviet Union was overthrown, he didn't abandon his commitment to Marxism. And they, of course, say in the first line, he was accused of being an apologist for brutal regimes. Unlike good left-wing intellectuals like Chomsky and Howard Zinn, who are mentioned in a very favorable light, they note that Parenti's influence fell after the 80s and 90s. His books were read alongside those of Chomsky and Zinn, who were better known and better selling. So, of course, the New York Times, which obediently supports every war, is saying you should support the good left-wing intellectuals like Chomsky, who criticize every actually existing socialist government. It's also interesting to see that they mentioned Bernie Sanders. Of course, Parenti was a longtime friend of Bernie Sanders. They both ran for Congress on third-party tickets from a socialist party, and Parenti obviously lost. And Sanders and Parenti had a falling out after Parenti opposed the US-led NATO imperialist war against Yugoslavia, the balkanization, dismemberment of Yugoslavia, which Bernie Sanders supported as kind of this compatible left. The New York Times also criticized Parenti, saying that he took positions that few others on the American left would take. Well, actually, many people on the American left did take these positions, but the New York Times is more interested in amplifying the views of the pro-imperialist, or at least anti-imperialist compatible left. They mentioned, for instance, Stephen Zunes, who's a great example of this. This is a guy who has always demonized every actually existing socialist government, demonized Cuba, demonized Venezuela, demonized Nicaragua, demonized China. He claimed to oppose the dismemberment of Libya, but he demonized Gaddafi and the Libyan government, demonized the Syrian government. I mean, always playing into the hands of imperialism and helping, take the football to the 95-yard line for, the imperial war machine. And then they say, well, we're against the bombing, but we support the demonization of every government that's currently being targeted by the empire. And it's quite appropriate. The perfect illustration of this compatible left is the New York Times mentions that Stephen Zunes has, he boasted in the imperial newspaper of record that he would piss off Parenti by wearing a t-shirt of Solidarity, which was literally funded by the CIA. So, I mean, this is the perfect illustration. This is the compatible left saying, yeah, I'm fine when I'm allying with the CIA against actually existing socialist governments. And then finally, this brings me to the end, which is this dichotomy of Parenti versus Chomsky, which if you follow the discussion about Parenti's passing on social media, this has always come up. And for me, this was very important as well, because when I was young and getting into left-wing politics, I was, very ignorant and susceptible to this kind of narrative of people like Chomsky, the left libertarianism, where you oppose every existing socialist government as authoritarian, but you do criticize the empire. I mean, Chomsky has done important work documenting the crimes of US imperialism, but then he demonizes every existing alternative to imperialism. And then for his entire career, when asked what people should do, Chomsky said, vote for the Democrats. Organize your workplace. I mean, that's obviously a good thing. And then vote for Joe Biden. Vote for Obama. So I think Parenti was always a much better alternative to Chomsky, a much better leader, a much better teacher. And it's not a coincidence that Parenti is not nearly as well known. Parenti was not given a massive platform in mainstream media outlets like Chomsky was. And, you know, we now know it's appropriate that we're having this discussion. It's, of course, very unfortunate that Parenti passed, but, you know, Chomsky has also really destroyed his reputation to the world. We now see that Chomsky was very close to Jeffrey Epstein. There are many emails, not just a few, many emails between them. Chomsky giving PR advice to this horrible man, I mean, who was also a CIA asset. I mean, like, Chomsky had just showed how much of an opportunist he was and disgraced his entire career and all the work that he did. And that's why I think it's so appropriate that Chomsky became like the kind of saint of the American left, whereas Parenti was always demonized. And one other quick point here before I conclude. You know, I have this image here comparing inventing reality to manufacturing consent. First of all, the leading author of manufacturing consent was Edward Herman, who has been basically entirely erased. When this book is mentioned, it's almost always mentioned as Chomsky's manufacturing consent, erasing the lead author. But even aside from that, objectively, I recently went back and revisited. Inventing reality is a better model, a better analysis of the corporate media and how it serves the interest of the ruling class. So I think for me, Parenti was such an important figure for me for realizing the kind of role that people like Chomsky have played on the US left as a figure who, yes, criticizes the crimes of the empire, but opposes all of the alternatives to capitalism and imperialism. So Parenti for me was a legendary figure, hugely influential on my life, and I feel very privileged to be able to participate in this event today and to honor his legacy. So I want to thank everyone for listening and watching, and everyone also who's participating, and thanks to everyone who organized this today.
Thanks so much, Ben, for those extremely important points. And I think, you know, anyone who's familiar with your own work and communication style will be able to identify Michael Parenti's positive influence there. I'm glad you raised this issue of how principled he was. And it's interesting to think about how many opportunities Parenti must have had over the course of his 50 plus years of activity to compromise those principles for the sake of, you know, succumbing to imperialist cultural hegemony. But he chose to stay true to the global working class. And if only more followed that example. So our next speaker is Ali Kadri. Ali is a professor at Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, China, and the author of an array of important books, including China's Path to Development Against Neoliberalism, The Accumulation of Waste, A Political Economy of Systematic Destruction, and The Unmaking of Arab Socialism. So go ahead, Ali. I'll ask you to unmute.
I thank everyone for putting this together, because Parenti obviously is a man who deserves much praise, especially that he was a radical thinker, and he saw he was along the Leninist lines. He foresaw that reality is radical, and that the thought that addresses reality has to be radical. And for someone from the third world, it's the fall of the Soviet Union was catastrophic across. It represented an ideological crisis for socialism, and I think the courage of the man sort of shines because he kept steadfast to the principles of socialism, and the socialism has actually succeeded. It hasn't failed when it was practiced. It had lifted many people millions out of poverty. So socialism as a historical process, and I think Ben sort of caught the gist of things when he says he put history back in historical materialism. So in a sense, he was capable of reading reality as it is, and reading the socialist experiments as successful experiments that while they lasted, they have actually lifted people out of poverty. And I remember always, for instance, in the case of the Congo, while while under Belgian colonialism, there were just a few doctors in the country, but even under Mobutu, the Congo was able to educate and bring back thousands of doctors. So the worst form of independence are probably better than the colonialism that prevailed then. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind, because so many people, the ideological crisis had taken over the minds of so many left socialist intellectuals, and not only in the developed world. It's particularly difficult to be a socialist of such character, but even in the developing world, many communist parties were basically dropping the idea of socialism altogether and changing the names of communist parties. They looked like they were more paper tigers than imperialism itself. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind is this reading of history as the totality that is not read as a totality. It's partitioned. We read history in bits and pieces, but we do not look at the overall picture. And his capacity to read history and his ability to go back in history and look at, for instance, his work on Julius Caesar, that the way it was portrayed in the mainstream media is such that it was some sort of conspiracy, but it wasn't a conspiracy. There were a materialist dialectic that were shaping events then. So Caesar, this particular Caesar, apparently was making some concessions to the poor that the plutocracy then was not happy with, and even minor concessions to the commoners and to others than the nobility. That itself was good enough for the plutocracy to turn against Caesar and assassinate him. And so there is that reading of the materialist circumstances, the class circumstances shaping history and shaping the development of history. He was able of seeing this way back. And another thing is his capacity, the idea of not failing when there was an ideological crisis. His idea was that the historical narrative was that poorer countries were not poor. They were made poor, because the mainstream always argues that we are the developed West, and we are about to bring wealth and prosperity through the free market economy, which there's not, as he says, there is nothing free about the free market, to the developing world. But instead, this once imperialism ties and hooks up the developing countries to the center, to the imperialist center, they become one and the same. And when they are one and the same, they are destined as the underdog to de-develop further and further. And de-development further and further is to basically starve and live shorter lives relative to the prevailing conditions of the productive forces at the time, and so we see that in his stance. And what one might say about the method, in particular, is this it's something I started with, is he doesn't see a partitioned reality. He sees a holistic picture, a totality. And in that totality, he sees a law of development. And that law of development under imperialism is itself an intensification of the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. And subject to that law, and under the command of the merciless imperialist financial class, what we're going to get relative to what we could achieve under socialist principles is much more death and disease and poverty and so on. And that's I think, from my perspective, the kernel of his methodology. It's a clear vision of the totality, a clear vision of the law that drives the development of such totality, and furthermore, the idea of in that there was an idea of the primacy of politics always prevailing, that things should be the working classes, which is for him obviously was the global society, because that's what the working classes. He didn't partition working classes by reifying the national identity, but he just saw the global society as the working class. And the global society all of it is coming under attack from the central imperialist class, which which gains by destruction, which accumulates by destruction. And destruction means the destruction of life, both natural life and human life as well. And that's, I think, is one cannot say enough in praise of a person whose life is a story of struggle. But I think that's all I have to say. Thank you. I don't know if I kept the time.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Ali. And you did indeed keep the time. I was just getting ready to ask you to draw to a close, and I was thinking, how can I do this to Ali Kadri, who anyone would happily listen to for several hours at a time. You could perfectly well be our own Fidel Castro. But that was great. And I thought really interesting that you brought up Parenti's book on the assassination of Julius Caesar, because it's like a masterclass in teaching and learning history in a way that's relevant to the current day, in that it draws these parallels between the struggle of oppressed against oppressor back then and the struggle of oppressed against oppressor now. Karl Marx famously wrote that all history is the history of class struggle, but this is a notion that's almost completely missing in mainstream historiography. So that book of Parenti's is one that's very well worth reading. So next speaker is Corinna Mullin. Corinna is an anti-imperialist academic. She is a member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, the Science and Society Manuscript Collective, Secretariat of the US Peace Council, and CUNY for Palestine and Labour for Palestine. Go ahead, Corinna. I might need to unmute you. Hold on. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Just one. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with such an incredible panel of so many of my intellectual heroes to discuss the life and legacy of another intellectual hero of mine, Michael Parenti, who is a true guerrilla intellectual, to borrow Walter Rodney's phrase. Parenti refused the usual careerist, as we've heard already, bargain of the colonial capitalist academy to water down his ideas, to make them compatible with empire in exchange for prestige and institutional protection. Instead, he chose political and ideological clarity, and he paid the price for it. As his son Christian Parenti recounts in a recent Gray Zone tribute, Parenti was red-baited, blacklisted, and forced into itinerancy, not because he lacked brilliance or productivity. And anyone who goes through his incredible, extensive list of publications knows what a prolific scholar he was, and more so than, of course, 99.9% of tenured academics, for sure. but because he had become politically dangerous. And this is where this concept of the compatible left, which Ben discussed incisively earlier, is so clarifying, and where Michael Parenti stands unmistakably as its antagonist. Gabriel Rockhill, in his new book, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, helps us name what Parenti's own life and career already demonstrated, that knowledge production and ideological circulation are strategic fronts in class war on a world scale, embedded in what Rockhill calls the imperial superstructure. Academia functions as part of the broader propaganda system, a dense web of institutions, patronage networks, prestige circuits, and ideological gatekeepers that reward critique only when it is sharp in appearance but safe in effect. What gets funded, promoted, and canonized is criticism of capitalism in the abstract, carefully insulated from class struggle, anti-imperialist commitments, and from defending actually existing socialist or anti-systemic projects, as you pointed out, Carlos. Parenti refused that insulation, and the marginalization he faced makes visible the very system that Rockhill describes so brilliantly in his book. Of course, Marxists have long understood the centrality of bourgeois propaganda in information warfare. Lenin grasped this with remarkable clarity in Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, where he warned that it is impossible for the bourgeois state to secure the allegiance of the masses without a widely ramified, systematically managed, and well-equipped system of persuasion, as he put it. One built on, quote, flattery, lies, fraud, and the juggling of quote unquote fashionable and popular catchwords, and the endless promise of reforms and blessings so long as people renounce revolutionary struggle. Michael Parenti's work can be read as a sustained empirical elaboration of that insight, showing how this propaganda system actually functions in everyday political life. Beginning with Inventing Reality and continuing through make-believe media and later work, Parenti demonstrated that propaganda in the US operates less through crude falsification than through the administration of legitimacy itself, through defining what counts as serious, objective, and reasonable. As Parenti put it succinctly, the media do not simply report on the world, they do not just reflect reality, they help create it. What made Parenti's intervention scandalous was not the claim that media bias exists, something that even mainstream critics occasionally concede, but his insistence that bias is structural. It's embedded in ownership, advertising dependence, elite sourcing, institutional access, and the class power that sets the boundaries of acceptable debate, allowing critical voices to appear only so long as they do not challenge the underlying structures of capitalist and imperialist power. And of course, that's why Parenti feels so urgent now. We're living through a moment when the mythology of the free press and academic freedom looks thinner by the day, and when long canonized public figures are increasingly revealed as entangled in depraved ruling class networks of power and influence. The release of the Epstein files Ben talked about has laid bare the occult workings of the Zionist imperialist core deep state, networks that many would have once dismissed as conspiratorial. And yet, even as these revelations have implicated figures often treated as part of the dissenting or critical intelligentsia, including compatible left figures like Noam Chomsky, there has been unsurprisingly little systematic analysis, at least in the mainstream, connecting these exposures to how ruling class power actually operates. Parenti, of course, helps us to understand why such episodes should not be approached as isolated scandals or individual moral failure, but as structural features of capitalism and its ideological order. He gives us the theoretical and ideological tools to understand how the Epstein files offer a rare window into the mechanisms through which opportunism, coercion, and greed are cultivated, rewarded, and leveraged by the bourgeois state, not deviations from capitalist norms, but expressions of them. Parenti's sustained engagement with the question of conspiracy is indispensable for understanding the current conjuncture. Across his books Against Empire, Dirty Truths, America Besieged, and History is Mystery, Parenti argued that the label conspiracy theory functions as a disciplinary weapon. Elites do not rule by accident or coincidence. They coordinate through institutions, shared class interests, and deliberate planning. What is ideological, Parenti reminds us, is not the claim that power conspires, but the insistence that vast systems of domination somehow operate without intention. Seen this way, contemporary revelations about elite networks are not shocking because they involve secrecy. They're shocking because they momentarily puncture the dominant ideological fiction that elites across multiple sectors, politics, finance, real estate, culture, the liberal professions, and even academia, do not constitute a ruling class with shared interests and mutual forms of protection. This is precisely what the compatible left cannot confront. It criticizes power in the abstract while recoiling from analyses that name institutions, coordination, and imperialist interests. And Parenti refused that capability. You see that in his 2012 essay, Iran and Everything Else, which I recently discovered researching for this talk and was struck by how prescient it was as the US ruling class, now under Trump, once again escalates imperialist aggression and threats of another kinetic war against the state. Parenti dismantles the nuclear weapons scare as a pretext, noting that Iran's real crime is not hypothetical nuclear bombs, but economic nationalism and refusal to submit to imperialist discipline. And he adds unsentimentally that if Iran were ever to seek a nuclear deterrent, it would be entirely understandable, given that the US has never attacked a country that actually possesses nuclear weapons, as cases like North Korea demonstrate. It's a reminder that politically and ideologically solid and courageous work rooted in historical dialectical materialism stands the test of time. Parenti's refusal is also clear in his analysis of the university itself. Parenti's analysis prefigured so much of the critical work on the academy today. He was explicit about the university's structural complicity with state power, capital, and the imperialist national security apparatus. Universities, he insisted, are not democratic spaces. They are corporate institutions governed by boards of trustees representing ruling class interests, unelected, unaccountable, with final authority over budgets, curriculum, and even personnel. This analysis is laid out in Parenti's 1986 lecture, Monopoly Culture and Academic Freedom, delivered at the University of Vermont in Burlington. In it, Parenti discusses the impact of ongoing McCarthyism on the academy, bringing in his own experience of having been fired at UVM. After already facing repression elsewhere, and despite the fact that by every professional measure, teaching, publication, service, he was exemplary. What ultimately triggered his firing from the University of Vermont, of course, was not incompetence. It was his open public opposition to US imperialism, his refusal to perform patriotic rituals he regarded as hypocritical, and his visible support for the Vietnamese liberation struggle, including carrying a National Liberation Front Viet Cong flag in public demonstrations. The Board of Trustees overrode faculty, administrative, and departmental support and labeled this unprofessional conduct. In other words, siding publicly with those resisting US imperialist violence crossed an unforgivable line. And we know that line has not moved. Seen in this light, the repression of campus movements over the past several years, and especially heightened in the context of the genocide in Gaza and resurgent fascism, is not anomalous. It's a textbook example of Parenti's analysis. Universities have collaborated with the police, FBI, wealthy donors, state and federal agencies, Zionist and other right-wing organizations to suppress organizing that exposes their complicity in imperialist war and settler colonial genocide in Palestine and beyond. Students and academic workers challenging investments, research partnerships, and institutional alignment with settler colonialism have been suspended, expelled, arrested, fired, and blacklisted. As Parenti, and I'm concluding, pointed out with such eloquence in this lecture, when students expose university ties to the CIA or complicity in imperialist war, the police arrive on behalf of the trustees, not the students. The state intervenes to protect, he says, class property interests, not free inquiry. Liberal critique is tolerated, solidarity with resistance is punished. And yet Parenti never stopped insisting on struggle. His pedagogy mattered as much as his theory. Long before podcasts and social media, Parenti made rigorous Marxist analysis accessible through public lectures, now widely circulated online. And of course, not as branding, but as urgent political education designed to inform action. So may we honor Michael Parenti by doing what he did so beautifully, telling the truth, even or especially when it is costly, defending the targets of empire and making our ideas useful for liberation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Corinna, for that extremely powerful and incisive presentation. And I mean, there's a thousand threads to pick up there, but just to pick up one of them, I'm super glad that you brought up Lenin's pamphlet on imperialism and the split in socialism, which is kind of the canonical text for explaining the material basis of opportunism and social chauvinism that we've been talking about. The opportunism and social chauvinism that Parenti and a handful of others have been able to reject. That material basis is, of course, imperialist super profits. It's the flow of value from global south to global north. But these are things that it's very unfashionable and very unpopular to talk about. So that's great that we're bringing it up. Okay, on to the next speaker, which is Shiran Illanperuma. Shiran is a journalist and political economist based in Sri Lanka. His research focuses on industrial policy and the importance of industrialization to national liberation and socialist construction. Shiran is a researcher with the Tricontinental Institute. And I will ask him to unmute. Okay, go ahead, Shiran.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Carlos. First of all, it's a great honor and actually quite humbling to be speaking at this event about Michael Parenti, huge hero of mine and definitely very formative for my own intellectual development. And it's also like very great company to be in among this panel. I'm going to talk about three main points, three main ideas I wanted to share about Michael Parenti. Based on his work, based on his enduring influence and relevance, right? And I think this is going to overlap inevitably with a lot of things that the other people have said so far and will say in future. Michael Parenti was fighting in the battle of ideas at a time when it felt like the war was lost, right? Everyone touches on this point because it's such an important point. I mean, I was recently rereading Black Shirts and Reds. I think it comes out probably around 96, if I'm not mistaken. So this is, it's already about 5 years since basically the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And, he is defending quote unquote actually existing socialism, which wasn't existing at the time, but, he was defending the socialist system at the time, which took an incredible amount of guts, I think. But more than anything, I think it takes a certain amount of patience and resolve and confidence in your own ideas to be able to maintain a line, to be able to maintain a kind of class line in the face of severe adversity and, what seems like doom and gloom, what seems like loss, right? And, I just want to say it's relevant even now in the current moment, the current conjuncture. Take this year, for example, the way this year opened up with the Trump administration brazenly attacking the sovereign government of Venezuela, illegally kidnapping its president and first lady. Quite frankly, I know a lot of comrades in private, but also often in public, were very disoriented by that, right? They're very disorientated by these developments. Not to speak of, for example, the ongoing genocide in Gaza. These things, no matter how strong your beliefs are, how strong your conviction is, you often can't help but feel, a little bit intimidated, a little bit demoralized, right? And I think something you can learn from Michael Parenti is, the way that didn't really get to him, or at least it didn't seem to get to him. He was doing what he was doing. He was maintaining the line. He had a confidence in his ideas, and I think he had a kind of long view of history, which those of us from the Marxist tradition need to have. We need to understand that there are zigs and zags, twists and turns in history. There are moments and periods in time when it feels like there's an upsurge in our favor, right, for our movement. And then there are times where it seems like things are turning the other way. The key, I think, particularly for people in organizations, the people that are doing long-term work, is to kind of stand still and stand strong amid all of that. And for me, Michael Parenti is like a very inspiring figure when it comes to that. The second point I want to talk about was his style of communication. And this has been brought up already. The institute I work for, the Tricontinental Institute, we've been trying to do this thing called Tricontinental English, kind of mixing academic writing, mixing journalistic writing, and, naturally a little bit of polemics, politics comes in there as well because you're trying to persuade people. And it struck me rereading Parenti recently is that This guy was a master of those things. He was able to communicate complex theory without using theoretical terms. Not that there's anything wrong with using theoretical terms, but you always need that strata of intellectual that can produce popular literature, popular material, right? So, I always get reminded of his speech, in the Yellow Parenti speech, where he says, the revolution that feeds the children gets my support, right? He was talking about, actually existing socialism, blah, blah, blah. He was not using those words. Then he says you need to compare a post-revolutionary society with what came before, not with some abstract ideal. He's talking about historical materialism, essentially, right? But he's not using that term. So, I had the idea of those things long before I ended up actually reading Marx and, knowing the word for that idea, thanks to the way Michael Parenti was able to communicate those things, right? Parenti was, I think, what Gramsci would call a permanent persuader, right? He was an intellectual, and everything he does is so persuasive, but it has that journalistic flair and character. It has a certain academic integrity, right? But it's also persuasive. It's not something that's just floating in the air, which is something sadly you see very often in academia now. These papers after papers that just seem to be floating through space and time, and you don't know what they're trying to say, in what conjuncture they're trying to intervene, what sort of change they're trying to make in the world. And moving on from that point is very interesting to me is that this is a man from the quote unquote silent generation. That's what they call them in the US. He was anything but silent, but anyway, he's from the silent generation, and yet I would say he's probably incredibly popular among millennials and Gen Z. And this is again got to do with his style of communication. I first came across him on YouTube. There are people who are discovering him today on TikTok. Because of the way he communicates, he's able to basically, bite-size ideas. He's a very clippable speaker. And in some sense, he was so much ahead of his time because he is speaking and writing slightly ahead of the kind of digital revolution we have, the narrowing of the attention span, the vast simplification of writing, and even people's ability to concentrate and read and comprehend. It's objectively declining in a lot of societies. And through all of that, Parenti remains so relevant and so ahead of his time because of his communication style that was able to bridge all of these different needs, that was able to popularize complex and theoretical ideas, right? And that brings me, I think, to my third point, which is the fact that, look, Parenti was not just an intellectual. I mean, sure, like he was an organic intellectual as well, right? It's not just not just a traditional intellectual in the universities, but this is a guy who was from the working class. He was a guy who, I'm currently reading his memoir, Waiting for Yesterday, where he talks about his working class upbringing in Italian neighborhood. It's very touching. It's probably the most favorite thing that I've read of him, right? And you really get to understand where this guy comes from, right? And it's not just, when he speaks and when he has that sort of flavor and character, it's not just the theories that are jumping out of him. It's his own experience as a working class person in the United States, right? His own experience of, race and class and how these things intersect, and his understanding of imperialism and so on and so forth, right? But even beyond that, you see very clearly, and I think our comrades in North America and Europe probably know much better than I do, that this is a man who was always steeped in the struggle. He was not someone who was a free-floating intellectual. He was organizing, he was at protests, he was talking to workers, and so on and so forth. That was a purpose, right? This is an intellectual who it was tied to the movement, which again is such a very, very vital and important point for today. And he did all of these things at the cost of his own career. Very difficult thing to do, especially someone who's already from a poorer background. It's quite easy sometimes for people who come from a position of a little bit of privilege to become a left-wing intellectual because you have a certain amount of in a way much harder for a lot of people who come from a working class or a quote unquote subaltern background to make those sacrifices, right? But he was committed to the struggle. And yeah, I think I'm going to just end my intervention there. So, he fought in an organic intellectual, a real inspiring individual, and I think very relevant still for today. I think I don't know what he would think, but for what it's worth, he remains in some ways more relevant for today and today's generation than he was during his time.
Thanks very much, Shiran. And yeah, I completely agree, and I think everyone here completely agrees that his gifts as a communicator, both as a writer and a speaker, are a really important part of the totality of Michael Parenti. And his son, Christian Parenti, brings up in the interview that Corinna, I think, referenced. He says, my dad was actually a pretty angry person. He felt this visceral anger towards the system that produces violence and oppression and poverty and inequality. And he was able to channel that anger into a very effective communication. And on top of which Ben has mentioned, Parenti was also very witty. And I just want to quickly read a little quote from Black Shirts and Reds about the absurdity of Western anti-Soviet propaganda. It goes, during the Cold War, the anti-communist ideological framework could transform any data about existing communist societies into hostile evidence. If the Soviets refused to negotiate a point, they were intransigent and belligerent. If they appeared willing to make concessions, this was but a skillful ploy to put us off our guard. By opposing arms limitations, they would have demonstrated their aggressive intent. But when in fact they supported most armament treaties, it was because they were mendacious and manipulative. If the churches were empty, this demonstrated that religion was suppressed. But if the churches were full, it meant people were rejecting the regime's atheistic ideology. If the workers went on strike, this was evidence of their alienation from the collectivist system. If they didn't go on strike, this is because they were intimidated and because they lacked freedom. This sort of absurd Cold War anti-communist propaganda is very redolent of what we hear these days in relation to China especially, but also Cuba, Vietnam, the DPRK, Laos, Venezuela, and other countries. So on to the next speaker, which is Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel is a philosopher, writer, and academic. He's editor of the English language edition of Domenico Lasordo's Western Marxism and author of the recently released Who Paid the Purchase of Western Marxism, which book is causing something of a stir. Gabriel is also co-founder of the Critical Theory Workshop. So Gabriel, please go ahead. I will ask you to unmute.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you to all of the other organizers and the other panelists. So history is a major site of class struggle. Now that Parenti has officially entered history, it is imperative that we carry his legacy forward by lifting him up as a figure who towers over the compatible left intelligentsia, promoted by the imperial superstructure, as a few other speakers have already mentioned, if it be Noam Chomsky, Slavoj Žižek, Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, or others of their ilk. Michael Parenti was not only one of the greatest thinkers, writers, and educators of his generation, he also maintained the red thread through some of the darkest years of anti-communist revanchism in the belly of the beast. By the red thread, I mean our connection to the wealth of collective, theoretical, and practical knowledge available in the global tradition of dialectical and historical materialism. From a working class background, he quickly matured beyond the progressive liberal framework on offer, which serves to contain the left, through a humble project of self-critique, fueled in part by his direct involvement in the anti-imperialist struggle against the US war on Vietnamese sovereignty. Breaking out of the ideological encasements predominant at the time, including certain tendencies in the New Left to supplant class struggle by culture wars, he undertook an expansive project of political education, writing dozens of magisterial works and providing brilliant lectures and interviews. I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that he has been one of the single greatest educational resources of his generation. This is most certainly the case in the belly of the beast, where the intelligentsia's level of political consciousness tends to be significantly limited by imperial indoctrination, but his reach extends around the world. The breadth of Parenti's work needs to be highlighted since he was invested in analysis of the social totality. Some of his best-known work, at least within activist circles, focuses on the real material history of actually existing socialism, which forcefully pushes back against so many of the myths and lies, as in his classic Black Shirts and Reds. His critical diagnoses of what he calls democracy for the few in the United States, and all of his insightful critiques of US-led imperialism, provide some of the best accounts of the settler colony that became the world's leading imperialist power. He also examined in detail some of the major imperialist endeavors and their consequences, as in his major work on the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia and his excellent late essay on Ukraine. These works are not often referenced in academic settings, at least in my experience, and they've had a lasting they've had a lasting impact on the broader world. His reach extends well beyond the themes that I've just mentioned, however, since he is also one of the most insightful media critics, and he's published some of the most important works on cultural class struggle, media manipulation, and propaganda. He has also engaged deeply with questions of historical methodology and the political stakes of history, as in History as Mystery, and he even wrote a fascinating history of Caesar and ancient Rome, as Ali mentioned earlier. The breadth of Parenti's engagements is seconded by their depth, and he has proven himself to be one of the most reliable scholars due to his diligent analysis of sources and the rigor of his research. At the same time, he is one of the clearest and most straightforward writers whose books are capable of reaching and educating a mass audience. There's much more that could be said about his project as a whole, but in the interest of time, I'd simply like to highlight a few more specific aspects of his contributions. The first is that form matters. Above and beyond all of the content that Parenti produced, he also modeled for us modes of political education that truly bring people in. Part of this was surely due to his humility, integrity, and warmth as a person, which clearly comes through in his lectures and interviews. However, he also obviously cultivated his communicative skills as an art form. His prose is poetic, without being pretentious. It is straightforward, but never overly simplistic. It brings the reader in and educates them rather than turning them off through unnecessary performances of intellectual superiority. His oral communication provides us with the complete range of human experience, leaving the listener with much more than just the content of what he's teaching. It models for us and makes us feel righteous anger at injustice, the fierce resolve necessary to stand strong against opposition, but also the humility and open-mindedness of someone invested in lifelong learning and who understands that the primary struggle is to change the world and that we have to do this together. His seriousness, though, is always combined with humor, and he can deftly move his audience from anger to laughter, from rage to mirth. He was, in short, a master communicator and a magisterial, as he says himself, raconteur. One of the many themes that I've been impressed by is his diagnosis of what he calls the gangster state, which provides an essential framework for understanding the imperial bourgeois state and elucidating the current conjuncture. Parenti developed this analysis in relation to the debate surrounding the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He rejected the dominant ideological position among major segments of the intelligentsia, including the once towering compatible left figure of Noam Chomsky, which was that it was conspiratorial to undertake a materialist examination of the evidence suggesting that the state narrative regarding the killing was hiding more than it was revealing. Parenti reminded everyone that the idea that groups of people would conspire to advance their own interests is readily admitted for many sectors of society. To take but one example, it was maintained for decades that there was a Judeo-Bolshevik or communist conspiracy to destroy Western civilization, something that is now coming back into vogue, particularly if you listen to Marco Rubio's recent presentation in Munich. The idea that there would be conspiracies in the sense of a group of people conspiring to advance their interests is thus clearly not the problem. The issue is really whether it is acceptable to engage in a materialist analysis of the ruling class and its state managers when they conspire to advance their interests. This is what is verboten. Parenti reminds us, quote, often the term conspiracy is applied dismissively whenever one suggests that people who occupy positions of political and economic power are consciously dedicated to advancing their elite interests. Even when they openly profess their designs, There are those who deny that intent is involved. Fearlessly rejecting these external, ideologically motivated limits placed on a materialist analysis of the social totality, Parenti investigated the evidence surrounding the Kennedy assassination and highlighted facts like the following. 80% of scholarly books at the time on the Kennedy assassination attributed it to a conspiracy involving intelligence agencies. 40 people who had information related to the assassination met violent deaths in the wake of the Kennedy assassination. In Hunt versus Liberty Lobby, a U.S. court of law found that, quote, President Kennedy had indeed been murdered by a conspiracy involving, in part, CIA operatives E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis and FBI informant Jack Ruby, end quote. We can draw one clear lesson from this. Yes, the ruling class and its managers conspire to advance their interests, and they besmirch intellectuals who reveal this fact as psychologically disturbed and quote-unquote conspiratorial in their thinking in an effort to kill the messenger so that the message doesn't get across. In other words, the ruling class and their managers conspire to label as conspiratorial researchers who reveal the material reality of their own conspiratorial activity. Another theme, and I'm arriving at the end of my comments, in Parenti's work that I'd like to emphasize in the current conjuncture is his analysis of media manipulation. He provides one of the most concise and insightful overviews of the propaganda tools used to indoctrinate us. I'd refer everyone, if they haven't read it, to the excellent and very short essay entitled Methods of Media Manipulation that was recollected in Contrary Notions. He highlights there a number of key tactics: suppression by omission, when the media simply leaves out certain fundamental stories; attack and destroy the target as soon as a journalist or an intellectual reveals something important, they try to destroy the messenger, as they did in the case of Gary Webb, who was essential to breaking some of the story of the CIA involvement in trafficking drugs from Latin America through the United States. Labeling, meaning the use of certain terms in order to communicate at an implicit level things that are helpful to the advancement of empire, like the term extraordinary rendition instead of international illegal kidnapping, torture, and often assassination. Taking it as a given, meaning how the media simply accepts certain narratives or certain orientations without even questioning them, which goes hand in hand with what he calls face value transmission, when the press serves as stenographers of power and simply reference things like American interests, the world community, and other such things. Repetition and normalization is, of course, very key, and we're all familiar with that. But also there's the slighting of content, meaning that there's an attempt to superficially reference elements that are at the limits of the dominant spectrum to create the illusion that there's an inclusive kind of balancing of perspectives, while ultimately always centering the more conservative-leaning, pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist orientations, as well as follow-up avoidance. So anytime anyone is able to puncture the kind of media complex, they're either cut off, slandered, made secondary, or, as we see very clearly in the Epstein revelations, they engage in the project of a limited hangout. They want to make it all about the villainous figure of Epstein and not ask essential questions like, who was Epstein working for and with? What are these people continuing to do? And how did the international pedophilia ring relate to all of the illegal activities they're engaged in with international criminal syndicates, with intelligence networks, with financial interests, and a whole series of other illegal activities on the part of the gangster imperialist states? These are the issues that we need to be pursuing instead of simply taking the limited hangout by the propaganda apparatus and running with it. Much more could be said, but I'd like to conclude by asserting that Parenti has made a fundamental contribution to the international project of liberation. He shall forever rest in power as a source of inspiration, a model of integrity, a magisterial educator, and a humble servant of what we might refer to as the anti-communist cause. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Extremely incisive and powerful as ever. And I would mention that Gabriel's own work over the last few years has been so important for helping us understand this phenomenon of Western left academia, like a Western left academia in which Michael Parenti, a leftist academic in the West, was a pariah, was completely beyond the pale, right? And Losurdo's Western Marxism, which Gabriel edited the English edition of, that came out on Monthly Review Press a couple of years ago, and Gabriel's own Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism, are both works that very much belong on your anti-imperialist shelves alongside Michael Parenti and others. So our next speaker is Immanuel Ness. Immanuel is a well-known political scientist and professor at City University of New York, who's written several valuable books, including Organizing Insurgency, Workers' Movements in the Global South, Southern Insurgency, The Coming of the Global Working Class, and the very interesting looking forthcoming title, Dialectics of Chinese Labor, Trade Unions Under Market Socialism, which I, for one, certainly hope to get the chance to review. So go ahead, Manny.
My stopwatch doesn't work, so I'll just try to keep it at below 10 minutes. I think Michael Parenti represents a specific kind of intellectual during the late 20th century, early 21st century. And that is somebody who was uncompromisingly socialist, a person who believed in the real world as opposed to the fictitious utopian world. He was very much interested in actual struggle as opposed to the kinds of struggles that people engage in the academy. And even in the academy, he was engaged in struggle. Before I was there, he was a professor at City University of New York, Brooklyn College, in my department, and several others here know are in the same department. And he actually went to battle against many of the right-wing forces. It was about the time when he wrote Democracy for the Few in the 1980s, 85, 86, when there was an uprising amongst Puerto Rican students who were discriminated against in Brooklyn College and CUNY at large. And he defended them over and over again. And he believed that the idea of learning was not just something that you do abstractly, just like socialist states are not abstract ideas. They are, but they're actually realities. So at Brooklyn College, and I'm sure at many other institutions, he was actually involved in organizing. So I just wanted to, give you a certain sense. He was frequently quoted in the right-wing press. And one of those presses, I was just talking to Barry about it, was the Commentary. I think that is a press that is a Zionist press, if I'm not mistaken. And he was attacked along with a number of people who don't deserve to be attacked as being somebody who was a Marxist political scientist at Brooklyn College and former fellow of the Institute of Policy Studies, which I don't think is all that great anymore. He defines the mission of the radical academic even more baldly, says somebody by the name of Herbert London, who ran for mayor of New York City, if I recall correctly. Our quote unquote, our job in academia is not only to reach out to working people, but also to remind our students that they're workers, that their struggle is also a labor struggle, that labor struggle is the most profound democratic struggle in our society. And he also was criticized for only selling 85 copies of the book, a book that actually turned out to be a bestseller and basically helped him survive in many ways. And so Democracy of the Few, I think many of us here used the book or used it in the past. It was updated perhaps 8 to 10 times, a lot of times, I'll say that. And I'd say one other a number of things. He was betrayed by the left, and not just the academic left, but a whole range of leftists that include identity politics people, that included people who, like Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, she completely chastised him in a way that was highly, I would say, disgusting. He was basically driven out of the academy by people who were administrators, not academics whatsoever. And in order to be legitimate, you had to distance yourself from Michael and others like him, because if you had any relationship with Michael Parenti, you also were considered to be part of the clique and so forth. And so I think that's very important, but he still went on. He went on to many different pursuits. I found it very interesting that he actually was both engaged in, and I think this is one of the key points, he was engaged in US politics and so forth, the arena of US politics. It sort of reflects his perspective that we have to engage in real life things, and many of us don't vote and so forth. So that's another point. But in this context, he was the only person amongst political scientists, American political scientists or political scientists writ large, he was also a theorist, who was able to bridge the notion of an American working class, an American working class that was representative of people who were oppressed in this country, African Americans, Latinos, etc., Asian Americans in some respects, and yet at the same time, the main point of his oeuvre would be the idea that it was significantly important and mostly important to fight against imperialism. Along with that, he recognized very early on and articulated when I was basically a kid, that it was very important to support socialism, and that there was a direct link between Soviet Union and China. I mean, this is explicitly said when I remember as a 10 or 11-year-old. There's a specific relationship between the Soviet Union and the anti-imperialist struggle. Like it or not, he actually said that. So I think that's a very important point. I'm going to leave the question of Yugoslavia to Barry, because he was very much involved in that struggle. I'd just like to say that he was not sanctimonious like all these other people. Well, Noam Chomsky was mentioned, but I would add people like Howard Zinn and Stoughton Lynd, who saw themselves as, somewhat above the fray, and they were the sages and so forth. But Michael Parenti was able to go out into the streets, into the public, and to get on his soapbox and talk about socialism, and he had a great audience by doing so. To close, I would like to say that in a nutshell, I found his work and his status to be one which was highly practical. He lived his political beliefs as opposed to people who just were armchair intellectuals and spoke about things. So he goes beyond the leftists who thought they were just a leftist, but he actually engaged in political struggles himself. I think perhaps the apogee of his political struggle was in Yugoslavia. So I'm going to just end it there. I don't know how many minutes I did, but thank you very much for having me.
Thanks very much, Immanuel. Incredible discipline. You got to 7.5 minutes. That's great, and really interesting to hear about Parenti's direct involvement in organizing and in working class struggle, where he was at, where he was working, where he was living. And as a number of panelists have mentioned, you've mentioned Michael Parenti's willingness to take on some very unpopular positions, if that's where his analysis took him, if that's where his political integrity and his research took him. And it reminded me that in 2003, Parenti published the essay Friendly Feudalism, the Tibet Myth, which goes up against and explodes the myths surrounding the relationship between Tibet and China, and this narrative about how Tibet pre-1949 was some sort of Shangri-La paradise, that it was peaceful, it was beautiful. Michael Parenti did the research, and he points out that actually Tibet pre-liberation was a brutal feudal theocracy, right? Where the vast majority of the population lived as serfs in conditions of desperate poverty and violence. And he says a true slogan of Free Tibet would mean supporting socialist China, supporting the process of land reform and development in Tibet. That's what the liberation of Tibet looks like. Needless to say, this is not an essay and not a point that won Parenti many friends in the liberal intelligentsia. So our next speaker is Barry Lituchy. Barry is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Barry's an expert on Baltic modern history and is author of the book Jasenovac and the Holocaust in Yugoslavia. He also has the singular honor of being acknowledged in Michael Parenti's book about the war in Yugoslavia, To Kill a Nation, for having provided critical feedback on the text. So please go ahead, Barry.
Thank you, Carlos, for organizing this event, and to all the panelists, thank you very much for remembering Michael. Unlike Noam, I was not friends with Jeffrey Epstein, but I was very good friends with Michael Parenti. So it's very touching to hear all of these brilliant and oops, what did I just do? I don't see you anymore. Sorry.
We can see you.
Oh, okay. Well, then it doesn't matter. Anyway, the first thing that we have to say about Michael is that he was America's foremost political scientist. And it's not just because of his books, his articles, speeches, and activism, but because in retrospect, we can truthfully say that his worldview and explanation of the U.S. political system and the U.S. global empire with its junior partners his analysis has stood the test of time, and it's the most accurate explanation of the world we have inherited. In fact, the mask of this supposedly benign international rules-based order was ripped off recently, even by the Canadian Prime Minister and banker, of all people, Mark Carney, at the World Economic Forum in Davos a few weeks ago, when he declared, quote, "We know that the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that it was enforced asymmetrically, that it was applied with very varied rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. But this fiction was useful." Well, of course it was useful, and that's what Michael was explaining to us for the past 60 years, why when these lies were held up as sacramental bread to be prayed to. Now everyone admits it's always been a lie. That's great. And so now we can fairly assess the imperialist system for what it is and praise those who have told it like it is. The only problem is that in the meantime, the system has killed millions of people all over the world, and as Bill Bloom once put it, killed hope itself in terms of establishing a better human future. Nevertheless, Michael left us with a legacy of writings and speeches against this imperialist system. Michael was born in New York Hospital in 1933, the third oldest hospital in the United States, established in 1771. I was born there 36 years later, and I know that the pediatric ward is located in the overhang of the over the FDR Highway and along the East River. So I think we can say that Michael was literally born on the banks of the East River. He grew up in the hard streets of the Italian working class enclave in East Harlem. And as was beautifully said earlier, his remarkable memoir of growing up there, Waiting for Yesterday, it will make you laugh and it'll make you cry. It exudes the warmth, the hilarious sense of humor Michael had, and his humanity. It also resonates with New York City kids like myself. Around 1989, I was teaching a course on international relations and was forced to use a textbook by my department chair that offered up the usual shibboleths about U.S. democracy and the altruistic global institutions. Fortunately, Michael had just published The Sword and the Dollar at that time, and it proved to be the perfect antidote to those ideological falsehoods that we were reading in the main textbook. But another indispensable book, of course, that Michael wrote and that I have used over the years is, of course, that textbook, Democracy for the Few. It can't be emphasized enough how this book's class analysis of the American political system is such an eye-opener. It is so well written. I always come back to chapter 4, my favorite chapter in the book, where Michael masterfully explains the U.S. Constitution as a product of the colonial slave-owning and mercantile capitalist class in early America, and how it never had any intention of establishing a democracy. He relies on his use of the Federalist Papers and Charles Beard, and and we learn exactly that the capitalist oligarchy that they designed and insist upon is exactly the same one that we've had since 1788. And only through class struggle from below did we salvage the Bill of Rights. I feel that this should really be a required reading in the United States, this particularly chapter 4. My personal relationship with Michael began one night in the 1990s when I cold called him about Yugoslavia. I had never spoken to him before. He told me immediately that he was glad that I had called him because he recognized that Yugoslavia was the next big front in the war against imperialism. Those were his words at the time. A little more than a month after the 78-day bombing of Yugoslavia ended in 1999, Michael and I led a 2-week fact-finding mission through the whole of Yugoslavia, witnessing the war crimes committed there by the United States and its NATO partners. Less than a year later, Michael already published his book, To Kill a Nation, a very tightly and written, argued treatise, still the best book written on the subject of the destruction of Yugoslavia by the United States and NATO imperialism. In it, he explains the war crimes, the thousands murdered by US and NATO bombings, but he highlights the main point of the imperialist intervention itself. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, there was only one country in Europe left with a socialist system, and that was Yugoslavia. The target of the bombing was not Yugoslavia's military. I'm literally talking about the bombing itself. It was all aimed at destroying the socialized property forms, the working class achievements of the Yugoslav socialist revolution. Yugoslav socialism was not the same as Soviet socialism, Chinese socialism, Cuban socialism. But as we say of China, how Chinese socialism is written in Chinese characters, so too we can say that the Yugoslav system of socialism was written in Cyrillic and Latin, in the Cyrillic and Latin alphabets of the 28 nationalities that formed the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia. The first targets of the bombing were the socialist property of the state media, the banks, the trains, the infrastructure, the schools, the car factories, all the achievements of the socialist state. And all while the liberal left was claiming on every platform they had that this was some sort of prison house of peoples under Milosevic's dictatorship, as Amy Goodman repeatedly claimed day after day on her Father Coughlin radio program. Michael never lost an opportunity to crack a joke and once exclaimed as we were walking through Belgrade, "Where are the cops?" I thought this was Milosevic's dictatorship. Well, of course, there were no cops on the street and there was no dictatorship. Yugoslavia had a freer media, a freer culture, and a freer political system than the United States ever had. In Black Shirts and Reds, there is a superb discourse, probably the best I've ever seen, as far as I know, on why those who criticize actually existing socialist systems and revolutions and the achievements are the vilest enemies of the working class and of people in general. Michael loved to talk about how this was how you knew that when the liberal left, when the liberal imperialists genuflect, literally bending on one knee, one of his favorite words, before the imperialist ideology and ruling class. You know when they're attacking the achievements of socialism and of actually existing socialism. Those are the true enemies. Say anything you want, but just make sure you condemn actually existing socialism, socialist system, and revolutions. And then he added in Black Shirts and Reds, a touching addition to this quote, "Some of us from poor families who carry around the hidden injuries of class are much impressed by these achievements and are unwilling to dismiss them as mere economics." Quote, that's end of quotes. I believe that sums up the viewpoint of a true working class socialist revolutionary. He ended Black Shirts and Reds also with a brilliant coda tying together the environmental struggle and the class struggle, noting that if we lose this fight against global capitalism, they may take us all down together with them once and forever, as he put it. No doubt Michael's writings leave us a great legacy, but I will remember the man and my friend who stood up to the lies against Yugoslavia when the entire world was genuflecting in front of the idols of the unipolar empire. As they say, courage is not the absence of fear, but fighting for the truth, even when the world is against you and you have plenty to fear. That's courage. And that combination of courage and genius is what Michael Parenti was all about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. That was really moving and very interesting. And incidentally, what a world we're living in when Mark Carney is cited favorably in an International Manifesto Group webinar. It's really fascinating to hear from the panelists about how they've taken inspiration from and made use of Michael Parenti's work over the years. And indeed, Black Shirts and Reds is probably, I would say, the single most important source that informed my short book called The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, that was published in 2019. So, it's great to be able to not just mourn Michael Parenti, but really to celebrate and sustain and make use of and uphold his work, his inheritance. He didn't, as people have said, he didn't have a lot of money, but what he's left for the anti-imperialist movement, what he's left for the global working class is absolutely priceless. So our last panelist is Sara Flounders. Sara is a long-standing political activist and author based in New York City. She's a contributing editor of Workers' World newspaper and a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition, the International Action Center, and the Sanctions Kill campaign. She's the author and editor of numerous books, including 2 on the war in Yugoslavia. Please go ahead, Sara.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, International Manifesto. We may be days, hours against a horrific war on Iran and a far wider war in Asia and a new level of strangulation of Cuba. So it's a crucial time to discuss Michael Parenti in time of war, endless war. And faced with the total violence of an imperialist war, we need action, agitation, and confrontation. And I say that I'm not an academic. I'm an activist, an organizer. And what I most valued, Parenti moved people into action. Michael Parenti spoke to those determined to resist. He was for the picket line, the demonstrations, the takeovers, and the armed struggle. The overwhelming corporate propaganda is designed to marginalize opposition, and the role of Western academics is to cushion vicious reality and create confusion, passivity, stand on the sidelines with petty criticism. Now, I can't duplicate the excellent points of other speakers, but I'll focus on the period when I worked closely with Michael Parenti, that decade of wars on the Yugoslav Federation. I'm glad to be speaking after Barry Lituchy. This was a time when there were few allies, and Michael Parenti was combative, unapologetic, and that was so refreshing. He got to the essence, the class truth of the issue. He posed it always as, which side are you on? And Michael Parenti was on the side of the working class, especially when they were under attack. He really saw it, the world in global terms, in a long struggle. And he knew on every issue he was against US imperialism. He proudly took sides. Then he got the facts and the details to back up his position. First, he took a side, and that's why he's really such a winning writer, in my opinion. The US and NATO powers organized with guns, money, tons of propaganda, the breakup of the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia into a half dozen weak mini-states. Their goal was to assert US military and political dominance in Europe through US-commanded military alliance, NATO, and to violently crush, literally rip apart, the last independent government in Eastern Europe. The propaganda war succeeded, even in confusing most progressives in the West, with well-planned and executed offensive lies that blamed every problem in the Balkans on Serbia and President Milosevic, who was wildly demonized as a fanatic dictator. It was one relentless scenario. So it's essential to remember that period. The 1990s, corporate globalization seemed all-powerful. The collapse of the Soviet Union, all the other socialist countries in Eastern Europe, the catastrophic drop in aid once given to Cuba, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and throughout Africa, the years of unrelenting war propaganda created in that time great demoralization and confusion. Now, Yugoslavia was a Clinton, Madeleine Albright Democratic Party war. It's not Bush and the Republicans, as during the Iraq War. And this further silenced any liberal opposition. So I really value those who are willing to jump into a struggle when it's difficult, and those who use their talents to help cut through the layers of wild propaganda. The Balkan Wars began with the US-German recognition of the distinct republics of Yugoslavia as suddenly independent entities under NATO control. And then came the NATO bombing of Bosnia, 22 days to impose the Dayton Accords. In Bosnia, and I was there at that time, they saw the absolute ruin, the resulting dysfunction that the US intentionally created. Always it was Serbia that was to blame. The US role was a peacekeeper. Now, I was in Serbia during the darkest days of the US NATO bombing in May 1999. It's a delegation. In 78 days, NATO destroyed 14 tanks. Yugoslavia didn't have a large military, but they bombed 480 schools, 33 hospitals, busy marketplaces, churches, bridges, passenger trains, crowded buses, and the electric grid. It was overwhelmingly civilian targets and civilian infrastructure. That delegation during the war was followed by Michael Parenti and Barry's trip to Yugoslavia shortly after the war, because we really needed here in the US voices of opposition and of solidarity. We organized together mass US war crimes tribunals, gathering testimony, photos, eyewitness accounts, listing the names of every school and hospital and marketplace that was hit. These were big public events. They're forgotten even here now. There were hearings throughout Europe and the US. I worked with the former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark for years on this campaign. Michael Parenti was an incredibly fast and comprehensive writer and an extraordinary speaker in this time. Within months of his visit to Serbia, he produced To Kill a Nation, The Attack on Yugoslavia. It had my endorsement on the back cover, and it still stands. This is how I still feel about this book. To Kill a Nation is the best explanation of the great crime NATO committed and what it will mean for our future. It's full of insights on the role of U.S. militarism and media disinformation in the service of corporate profit. That's still true. It was our determination that history not be written by the victors. Michael contributed a chapter called The Media and Their Atrocities, and he helped John Catalanato and me and a whole team of activists to conceptualize how to organize this ton of material and graphs and lists and testimony that we had into a book titled Hidden Agenda, the US-NATO Takeover of Yugoslavia. Now, the war didn't end with the bombing and the brutal ceasefire agreement. Serbia was the first of a whole series of US orchestrated color revolutions. It established the template that was used again and again to overthrow elected governments by creating well-funded chaos in the streets. President Milosevic was overthrown. He was jailed in April 2001 and then literally kidnapped to the Hague prison in June of 2001 to stand trial for war crimes committed against his country. All the forces who had opposed the US-NATO war came together to form an international committee to defend Slobodan Milosevic. It was established in Belgrade and Berlin. And again, it took great courage for Michael Parenti to lend his name to this effort. He became the chairman of the US National Section of the International Committee to defend Slobodan Milosevic. Now, today, we're organizing to defend a US kidnapped, elected president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and the elected deputy of the National Assembly of Venezuela, Celia Flores. In doing that, we should remember the conduct of the Hague Tribunal. Milosevic was supposedly put on trial at a specially created international tribunal at The Hague, but he was refused a lawyer of his choice. Then he was refused the right to represent himself, and his microphone was simply turned off during major sections of this phony trial. After 5 years, in 2006, he was finally supposed to present his view, but he was medically assassinated. He claimed again and again he was being poisoned, being deprived of proper medications for his chronic heart disease, and we were in the midst of waging an international campaign that he received medical treatment when he died of cardiac arrest. So I want to salute Michael Parenti for standing up to the wall of US propaganda and aggressive military, political, and economic destruction. Today, we're in a very different period. A mere 25, 30 years ago, US domination seemed uncontested. It was the American century. The plan was global domination. And today, it's clear that US power, its infrastructure, and certainly its economy is in decline. That sanctions, tariffs, and war can't reverse their decline. So, in closing, I so recall that Michael stayed firm in his defense of President Milosevic. But even as that was happening, there was another period in history that has his attention. He would talk of it. He would pull up new facts when you're in conversation with him. He had such a wide-ranging historic interest. He was always curious, always class conscious in an encyclopedic way. His next book was The Assassination of Julius Caesar, A People's History of Ancient Rome. Why? Because the class struggle is the one constant. So let's never leave the writing of history up to the victors. Michael Parenti, presente.
Thank you very much, Sara. You always make such insightful and thoroughgoing presentations. And it's really important that you brought up the danger of an all-out war against Iran, and you linked it to the criminal 1999 war on Yugoslavia. You know, we're in a situation where the US-led imperialist system is, to coin a favorite phrase of Mao Zedong, hitting out in all directions. The attempt to suffocate Cuba, the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and first combatant Celia Flores. As you say, the threat of war against Iran potentially within the coming hours and days. And this brings up another thing that Parenti analyzed in a very deep way, that we haven't touched on that much today, which is the phenomenon of fascism and its utility to capitalism in crisis. You know, capitalism is at this point in a chronic crisis, potentially mortal crisis. And Trumpism is in the ascendancy throughout the West. ICE functions in the streets of Minneapolis and elsewhere as a modern-day stormtrooper force. The US is launching flagrantly illegal attacks around the world. It's supporting an ongoing genocide in Gaza. It's threatening war against Iran. So this project for a new American century increasingly requires the naked dictatorship of capital, both domestically and internationally. And it's very important for us to keep in mind, you know, the lessons that Michael Parenti gave us about the relationship between fascism, imperialism, and capitalism. So thank you once again. Thank you to all the panelists. We've had some really amazing contributions. Strictly speaking, we've got 16 minutes left. I think we'll, on this occasion, go a little bit longer, but I don't want to go past 1/4 So I'm going to take up to 5 questions and short contributions from the audience, and then we'll go back to the panel in the order in which people spoke, to respond to the questions, to respond to the Zoom chat, and to respond to each other's points. So please do raise your hands on Zoom if you'd like to contribute. I would ask members of the audience who are hoping to contribute to limit their question or contribution to maybe like a maximum of 2 minutes. And while people are thinking about whether they want to say something, I'll just announce the next couple of IMG events. Our next event is next Sunday, the 1st of March. The title is From Minneapolis to Tehran, The Rotting of US Imperialism. Confirmed speakers for that include Helia Dutagi, Matteo Capasto, Bikram Singh, Alan Freeman, Sydney Loving, Ali Al-Assam, and that will be chaired by Radhika Desai. And you know, we hope to bring together the parallels and the commonalities between the people of Minneapolis and the US in general, who are standing up against a rising authoritarianism and you know, fascistic ICE patrols on their streets, and the people of Tehran, the people of Iran, who are fighting back against vicious sanctions and threats of war by the US and its allies. The other event for your diary is Sunday, the 15th of March. That is Cuba Defends Humanity, We Must Defend Cuba. And the confirmed speakers are Ismara Vargas Walter, who is Cuban ambassador to the UK, Dan Kovalik, Francisco Dominguez, Arnold August, Helen Yaffe, Isaac Saney, and Julio Fonseca. So those are the next couple of events. I'll post the link to the Eventbrite for the Minneapolis to Tehran event in the chat right now. And then let's take some questions. I see a hand from Ben Mateus, and I had an email from Joel Ruggie indicating that he might like to make a contribution. So Joel, I think you're in the meeting, so you're on my list. Go ahead, Ben. I will ask you to unmute.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is great that you've organized this event. I mean, it's amazing that folks showed up and that you've had this event to talk about Michael Parenti. I came upon the works of Michael Parenti probably going back 10 years ago. I used to listen to Richard Wolff on YouTube, and then David Harvey, and eventually the algorithm led me to Michael Parenti. And then, the first time I listened to him, I almost fell off my chair because I couldn't believe the things he was saying. Speaking of the Iraq War, for example, like that was an eye-opening to me. And then the more I listened to him, the more I wanted to learn more from him. So, purchased a few of his books. Democracy for the Few, I think, was the first one I read. History as Mystery was probably the second book I've read. So this is really amazing. One thing though, just kind of going back to Michael Parenti, some of his lectures, he and I don't know which one it was, but he talks about how he wanted to. He never wrote a book about the Spanish-American War, right? And I was wondering if you know of any historical materialist a book perhaps that talks about analyzes the American-Spanish War.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. I'm not seeing any indications. Joel, since we had a brief interaction on email, I'm just going to ask you to unmute just to see if you want to come in. No, I'm not convinced Joel's around. Okay, okay, they've got a hand raised from Cooper. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise this question from the chat to make sure it gets said, but where does this like Parenti's analysis of the university, like where does it leave the Western university system, and like what are the future for universities, or like education in general? And then I was just also wondering if you have like any other resources or places to go where you can like learn more about Parenti's analysis of the university system, and just that point that he made a lot.
Great, thank you very much. And unless there's any more hands in the next few seconds, we'll go back to the panel. And I think all the panelists are here, with the exception, I think, of Corinna and Shiran. So we can afford to go for about 3 minutes each. Oh, last minute hand from Benjamin. Go for it, Benjamin.
Thanks for taking my question. My question is it time to consider the possibility of building some kind of anti-imperialist academia independent from, what we have, which Michael Parenti was both a victim and a critical?
Great. Thank you, Benjamin. Okay, so let's go back to the panel. Ben, if you're still around, we'll take you first. I'm not sure Ben is still around. No, I can't see Ben. Okay, sorry. In that case, Ali Kadri, please do come in.
Yes. I mean, in relation to Ben's question, I was, the project of building an alternative system of education, but not only an alternative system of education, in a sense, but of changing the parameters of dominant thought, the methodology of dominant thought, changing. I always remember. In Bertel Ollman, in his Dance of the Dialectics, I remember a small phrase where he says that kids who, before they enter school, they can draw a horse in movement, and dynamic movement, whereas once they've entered school, they forget that the world is dynamic, and they draw the legs of the horse as straight lines. I think we know that the educational system that the bourgeoisie creates on a global level, and the production of knowledge itself is a weapon against the working class everywhere. And the universities are going to produce the guns of capital, the intellectual and the real guns of capital. There's going to be, some people who escape that system, but they will remain on the margin. One can think of the American institutions abroad, and in Lebanon, for instance, there is an American University of Beirut, which is a missionary school established in the late 19th century. But in that school, I mean, that school is responsible for producing all the figures, the notable figures that ruled the Middle East. And yet it's touted, for instance, as a beacon of knowledge. Yet if we think about the interface of the knowledge it has produced with reality, when the people it has educated came into power, we see that the Middle East and Africa, it has educated many African leaders, it is a disaster. It has produced the knowledge that created the disaster. And the purpose of universities like that, but I think the establishment of an alternative university system is not sufficient, because we need to rework the structure of thought itself. It's something a la Bertel Ollman. There is something in the curriculum that distorts the methods of reasoning, such that no matter how we reason about the situation, if our methods are distorted, then we arrive at the wrong conclusion. The analytical methods, the empirical methods, all of these things are meant to distort reality. And sometimes reality speaks for itself. Parenti, when he saw the broader picture, he saw what has happened and how the continuity of history and the holistic trajectory of history, he was capable of without much intellectual effort right there, but there is much intellectual effort elsewhere. But in the observation itself, there wasn't much intellectual effort. But it was an area which it was so blatantly clear, yet it closed off to in everyone's mind, due to the fact that the production of knowledge, as Gabriel notes in his latest work, and Parenti also and others, that the production of knowledge is a tool against the working class. And it's not only about establishing an alternative system that we can have a people's university online and so on, but it is more than that. I think we have to question the way people abstract from reality, the way people reason from reality. We have to go back to basics, because it is the basics that have gone missing. The basics, what I mean by basics, is people are no longer in touch with reality. We have a planet that's almost on the way to disappearing, and yet there isn't an effective and efficacious resistance to the process of this self-destruction. So it's not only the institutions that need to be reestablished, because now I think we have a margin by which we can establish institutions through networking and online working and so on. But it's more about the whole structure of thought that has to be changed. The whole structure, and Parenti, I think, in a way, presents us with that basic structure, that following reality as it is, looking at the broader picture and following reality. And looking at the broader picture is a miserable thing, and that we should all be able to point out. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ali. Go ahead, Corinna.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ali. And, I mean, I think I agree completely. We need to go back to the basics and deal with these broader structural questions and epistemological questions and methodological, and I think that's really important point made across all of the presentations, and of course Michael Parenti's work about the importance of the historical dialectical materialist method. But I would also think that it's worth sort of thinking about how we struggle around these institutions, and maybe, as someone who's based in academia and also, who has faced some of the repercussions of not being, part of the compatible left, I lost my job. I was fired from CUNY, recently rehired, but one of the people who was fired alongside me is still is still blacklisted and accused of something very similar to what Michael Parenti was of conduct unbecoming. And I think it's important to build on, to learn, to be inspired from Parenti's praxis and how he, struggled within these institutions, against these institutions, and reminded, for example, of what when he was attacked by the police, right? The University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign at the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement. He joined the struggle with the students. And that student worker alliance is so crucial. It was then and it is now. And the encampments, the Gaza Solidarity encampments, for example, at our universities were bigger than just similar to the anti-war mobilizations of the time that he was struggling and when he was, subjected to state violence, as well as the violence of the institution. These Gaza Solidarity encampments were also about not just, one particular instance of imperialist, and Zionist warfare, war and genocide, but also about making the connections, the material connections between these institutions. And it's not just academia. Every institution in the bourgeois state is complicit with settler colonialism, with imperialist war, with genocide. And so, I think in addition to the sort of intellectual work we need to do to make these connections and move beyond the political confusion that the compatible left has really pushed in our institutions, and especially in academia. And that is such important intellectual work to help, especially, not just the students, because it's also the academics who are, are mostly, not just, are part of the problem. I think the students see things much more clearly. They are aware because, it impacts their daily lives. And they're the ones who have led the way in these past few years in making these connections, showing that the board of trustees are representing ruling class interest. They're financiers, Wall Street financiers, real estate moguls, corporate lawyers. Who do they represent? So the fact that he took on these institutions and their entanglements within the capitalist imperialist state is something that we need to learn from and continue to struggle, not just intellectually, but materially on the ground. Join those protests, defend the students who are being arrested, get arrested ourselves if that's what it takes. And that's what it did take for, in his case. And if it means getting fired, that, so be it, because that's, the least that we can do is put our jobs on the line. People are putting their lives on the line to fight and defeat imperialism. So yeah, I think those are some of the takeaway lessons that I would convey from Parenti.
That's great. Thanks very much, Corinna. Over to Gabriel.
Thanks. You can hear me? Yeah? Okay. Thank you for the questions and as well for the contributions of the other panelists. I'll go very quickly on Marxist analyses of the Spanish-American War. I don't know in Parenti's corpus. He certainly touches on it, and the reference that comes to mind is in Anti-Communist Impulse. He goes into some of this history. It's an excellent book in any case. He doesn't just do a deep dive into it, but he situates it within the broader history of the development of the US empire. Concerning the future of the universities, particularly in a case like the United States, it's very clear that the rise of fascism includes cultural and intellectual fascism, and what they're aiming at is a totalitarian control of the mindscape of the masses, and they're very intent on trying to push back any forms of critical thinking. And they also recognize that the university is, even in with all of its limitations, it remains dangerous because it is a site of concentration in which organizing can be more easily done, a la how it was done kind of in factories when there were larger production sites within the imperial core. And it's also a site of political education, and they're very intent on shutting that down. All of that is going to depend on class struggle and on us. And so maybe I'll conclude by addressing the third point. I think that in considering how political education relates to and is organically immersed within political organizing, we have to think strategically. And in doing so, recognize that there are different tactics that often serve different purposes, but can be interlocked in various ways. I do think that tactically, it makes absolute sense to use the university in every way, shape, and form that we can to advance our cause. We can use it as a kind of Trojan horse, as an organizing site and as a place for political education. It has its limitations, like any site, and those we have to be very vigilant about. And so a second tactic that is equally important and isn't mutually exclusive from the first is developing counter-hegemonic institutions of education, meaning platforms that allow us to collectively educate ourselves outside of the confines and restrictions of the university, like the International Manifesto Group, like what I've been doing with a number of fellow intellectuals and activists in the critical theory workshop, and many other platforms that we can point to. These tactics, though, if it be a kind of Trojan horse use of the academy as much as we can, counter-hegemonic educational and political platforms need ultimately to be linked to an overall strategy. We're not going to be able to have the educational forms that we need if we are either only working, with and against the university, and or developing alternative platforms that always need to survive on a shoestring budget, that are often attacked, that don't have the power and the resources that the ruling class has. The horizon of our struggle needs to be that we need to go in a socialist direction so that ultimately we can develop a socialist intellectual apparatus like the one they have in Cuba that they're trying to destroy, or in China, or in other examples that we could point to, because then we'll have the real state power necessary to fully educate the people, because the tools of education will be in the people's hands. And so I'll conclude by saying, two tactics and one strategy. I'm sure there are other tactics that people could add, but that we need to think about this in terms of the short, medium, and long-term struggle. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Gabriel. And over to Immanuel Ness.
Thank you, and thank everybody else for giving those great presentations. I mean, from my point of view, I think that every day I see that social science and historians teach propaganda. And I would say that's probably 95% of all faculty. You can't get a job without teaching propaganda, and that is propaganda of US imperialism, Western imperialism, capitalism, and so forth and so on. And so I don't think most people or most students should actually go to those classes. But yet, if you want to get a job, you actually have to go along with the narratives that are put forward by most academics in my field and many other fields. So it's a struggle. I think what we could do is try to develop a school or a university where, not the new school, but a university where people are actually not teaching propaganda and ideas that are distorted, incorrect ideas about the world. So in my own classes, I have to basically unteach propaganda. That's the most important thing for me to do, because students just get a line that's directed, basically from the State Department. And by the way, that's how you get ahead in graduate school as well. And then they believe these things. And so, on the question of Yugoslavia, for instance, it was just pointed out that Milosevic was actually innocent of all charges. That actually, as Sara pointed out, there was Barry, there was a 90-day bombing or 75-day bombing of Yugoslavia for no reason at all, none whatsoever. They killed more Serbians than anyone else, and it was a really horrific war. But if you say that, you're considered to be some kind of quote unquote Holocaust denier. I'm not kidding you. That's what people are called. I mean, I think some of you here know what I'm talking about. Anyway, that's all I'll say.
Great. Thanks a lot, Manny. Over to you, Barry.
Thank you. I'll just speak briefly on the question that someone raised about the future of education. In my view, Trump is a fascist. He was always a fascist. He is slowly imposing a more fascist regime on the United States, and that includes the educational system. So that means that we're experiencing, and this is something I foresaw actually going back many years, going back to Clinton's time, that fascism was coming to America. And I wrote about it in the 1990s, in fact, that we're going to see some kind of Gleichschaltungen, this imposition from above of a particular worldview into the educational system and into the university system. That's the real, that I think that's the attempt. That's what they're trying to do. So now the question is, how can we fight back against that? Well, I believe that the best strategy overall is for us to build an electoral third party, a mass socialist and anti-imperialist party in this country, in the United States, that is to say. I still believe that a mass party, electoral party, is the solution to many of the problems, to the class struggle, many of the issues that we've raised here today. And I don't really believe that there's any alternative to that except violent revolution or barbarism. So those are the options I think we have before us. I don't see the university system is so under attack and so completely being dismantled and underfunded and the iconoclasts are being hunted down. So yeah, I mean, Corinna knows this story better than anybody, since she's actually been fired for her free speech. But we are seeing the negation of the Bill of Rights, of the First Amendment, in every day, and we're seeing the murder of Americans in the streets of Minneapolis by paramilitary thugs. So what is that but the imposition of fascism before our very eyes right now? And so fascism has come home after we saved the Nazis, after we saved hundreds of thousands of German, Croatian, and Ukrainian Nazis. Now the true blowback is here, and we have to find some way to fight it. That's all I'll say.
Thank you very much, Barry, for a fairly stark warning. So last but not least, we've got Sara Flounders. Sara?
Well, thank you again to the International Manifesto, another great discussion. My ending thoughts are, and especially for the academics here who are teaching and are in universities, the most valuable in my opinion, and I was suspended and expelled and didn't go back to academia. So I'm saying as an activist that it's the activists on the university campuses too, those who were expelled and suspended and doxxed, who are the most valuable to protect and encourage, because they're the ones who, going forward, can make big changes. The one thing about Michael Parenti is he was for the picket line. You can't build a union without organizing strikes and picket lines. And it's the same thing in building movements. What was most valuable, and it really impacted the whole world, is the massive demonstrations for Palestine, for Gaza, these past couple of years. The huge outpouring and shutdowns against ICE. not only in Minneapolis, in Chicago, in LA, across the country. Those actions make the real difference. So I think for Michael Parenti, at least my experience with him was he wanted to be at the center of where there was struggle. And he never put down an event if it wasn't all that local grassroots activists hoped it would be. He was like excited to be there and interacting with the organizers. That's different than inviting sometimes a guest speaker who has just a view of themselves. He wanted to like engage. So it's not, if you even think of this past period, for most students, they learned more history, not in a university classroom, but in the encampments, sometimes just a few weeks or a month of the students organizing their own events. They learned it, absorbed it in whole new ways. And if you talk to any of them, they'll talk about what they learned in those encampments. That's when they were shutting the university down. So I think this is true even more so when we look at the walkouts and shutdowns, on the ice, this fascist repression, murders that are going on. I think it is the role that we have to encourage that, because the universities are frankly functioning as they're supposed to in this decaying capitalist society. We're not going to change it too much. So let's be heart and soul for those who are able to fight for change. That's the big thing we want to do. And I really will always salute Michael Parenti, because he was on those, picket lines, on those actions from his youth and all the way through into his very, very senior years. That's how he identified and was never embarrassed or ashamed to be there. So again, I'll just add Michael Parenti presente as a fighter, as really a revolutionary that never lost confidence.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sara. And thanks so much to all the participants and to everyone who's attended today. It's been, in my view, a very important, a very thought-provoking, a very illuminating event. And I'm just glad that we've been able to celebrate the legacy of Michael Parenti in this way. And to have the opportunity to learn from his work and from the work of all of our speakers today. And I'll just very slightly abuse my position as chair and close with the conclusion of a contribution I made to another event today, which was a hybrid event at Marx Memorial Library here in London for Red Books Day, because I think it kind of sums up what we've been discussing in terms of Parenti's work, how Parenti's work informs our activities in the here and now. And what I said was, Michael Parenti's analysis strongly supports the organizing principle of a global united front against imperialism, composed of the socialist countries, anti-imperialist forces around the world, and the working class and progressive movements in the imperialist heartlands. And it should inspire us to support China, support Cuba, support all the socialist countries, support national liberation from Palestine to Ireland, oppose imperialist war and aggression, organize against a rising fascism, support the forces of multipolarity and the defense of the United Nations Charter, counter the propaganda war, expose lies, build a powerful counter-hegemonic narrative. So all that's left to say is please do register for our next event, which, as I mentioned earlier, is From Minneapolis to Tehran, the Rotting of US Imperialism. That's next Sunday, the 1st of March, 4 p.m. British time, 11 a.m. US Eastern. A bunch of great speakers, and thanks again, and hope to see you all very soon.